What's going on, everybody? My name is Matt and welcome back to East Coast Sabers. Today we're going to be doing something fun as I show you how to take all of this mess here and turn it into a functioning Graflex flash handle. I'm going to take you on a guided tour of how to both assemble and install a vintage or replica bulb socket assembly into your vintage or replica Graflex flash handle. This video has been requested by a lot of people, so today we're finally going to jump right into it. But before we do, I want to point out that I will be using the most recent replica from the Graflex shop, but these instructions will work on any replica modeled off of a vintage or even a vintage itself. So let's get right into it. The first thing I want to go over is the tools you're going to need. Luckily, this job won't need many, but we do need a few. So the first thing you're going to want is a small flathead screwdriver. I prefer these small pocket ones. Second, you're going to need a pair of small needle nose pliers. I like these smooth jawed ones because they have less of a risk of damaging parts if they should slip, but you can do this with regular needle nose if you don't have any of these. You'll just have to be a little more careful. Third, you're going to want either the sink pin removal tool from the Graflex shop, as shown here, or a 1/8 inch or I believe it's a 3mm nut driver. And finally, you may want to get a pair of long surgical hemostat clamps. This is for installing the long electrical contact under the top pin. It's not completely necessary, and you can build this without them. I've just found it much easier with them, but we'll get to that later. So before we can get to assembling everything, we need to remove everything from the packaging and get it sorted so that we can take inventory. Now, TGS usually packages everything in these little bags and ships them inside the flash itself. So let's get it all out and empty the bags onto the bench so we can see what we're working with. So, with everything spread out, let's go over what you should have apart from the upper and lower shells and the clamp. Included in your flash kit, you should have the 3 plastic pieces of the bulb socket assembly itself, the upper, the middle, and the lower. 2 long flat blade screws for assembling the 3 pieces of the bulb socket itself. 1 steel ring spacer, 1 brass washer, 1 brass bulb contact and a spring, 4 brass sink pins. Now, whether these are stepped or smooth will depend on which version you buy. 2 brass sink tabs, 3 very small sink pin springs. Now, one of these may be pre-installed in the bulb socket. Keep an eye out for that. Two steel electrical contacts. 2 square drive steel contact pins. 2 reflector dish studs and the springs to go with them. 1 side switch assembly, which makes up the plate, the E-clip, the internal arm, and the stud. You should have more than 1 E-clip. We'll go over more on that later. 1 long electrical contact, bent at a 90-degree angle with a piece of shrink tubing wrapped around it. The bunny ear assembly, which is made up of the 2 ears, the threaded rivet, and the threaded spacer. 1 glass eye and a test bulb. although this may be a second red button if you are doing an ESB version. One red button, one small rectangular nut and countersunk screw, and one beer tab comprised of the tab itself, the small washer, and the small threaded rivet. So, with everything laid out and inventory taken, let's get started on the actual assembly. The very first thing you're going to want to do is to install the slide switch assembly into the upper shell. To do that, simply take your stud, as shown here, install it through the plate with the dimple facing forward and down. As you can see, it is a dimple. It's difficult to make out, but it is concaved on one side and convex on the other. You want to make sure that the raised area is facing downward. So simply slot in the stud, slide it through the shell, again with the dimple facing forward. And this part can be rather tricky, but you want to take the internal arm and either using a pair of pliers, or I can normally do it just using my finger, and you want to slide the square hole over the stud with the bent arm portion facing the rear. It's difficult to make out, but once you have the arm installed properly, you should be able to see the small groove for the E-clip. Now, simply take your E-clip and install it on the slot. Now this part can be tricky, and it takes ideally 3 hands, but with a pair of pliers, grabbing the E-clip, and this is going to be very difficult to put on camera. I'm going to do my best here. You should be able to get it in and slide it into the groove, and you can't see that. So I have it just started on the groove, if you can see that, but it's not on all the way. E-clips need to snap into place. They're spring loaded and they need to snap. So I'm going to use just the screwdriver, and I'm just going to push it into place. And just like that, you should hear a snap, and the E-clip is firmly locked into position. Now, it is very common for these clips to go flying out while trying to install them, which is why TGS usually includes extras. Once the clip is installed and the switch assembly is secure, you're going to want to bend the internal arm forward just slightly. We'll get more into this in a moment, and I'll show you how to judge when it's right. But for now, just give it a little tweak to start with. Here you can see that it's bent forward. It's not a complete 90-degree angle. With the slide switch assembly done, we can get on to assembling the bulb socket itself. Step 1 will be to take the middle section of the socket assembly in the small flat contact washer. Place the washer over the stud of the assembly with the concave portion up. Next, take the U or J-shaped electrical contact, the ring spacer, and the upper socket assembly. Install the ring spacer in the hole in the back side of the assembly and slide the contact between them. Now we can take our brass bulb contact and spring and install it over the stud of the midsection. Install the upper section over the midsection and both of those over the bottom. Now these will be under spring pressure, so be careful to hold them tight as you use the 2 long screws to secure the 3 pieces together. Before you fully tighten them together, mind the alignment at the groove for the slide switch. You want to make sure there are no raised edges anywhere for the slide switch stud to catch on. If it does, the switch won't work properly. So make sure all three pieces are flush with one another and tighten screws down. Now, before we go any further, slide the entire assembly into the flash and check the movement of the slide switch. You want full movement without it getting hung up or snagged anywhere. You also want to make sure the switch arm can move into the proper position when the test bulb is installed later. To do this, simply look through the glass eye hole and slide the switch to the forward-most position. With it as far forward as it can go, you should be able to see the arm protruding almost halfway into the hole. So you can see the arm. It should protrude into the hole like so. If it's not, remove the socket assembly and bend the arm forward more. Repeat this until the arm is where it needs to be. Once the slide switch is adjusted and confirmed to have the proper travel, remove the socket assembly so we can install the last few pieces. Next, you're going to want to take the two reflector dish springs and studs, and with the stem of the stud sitting in the spring, lightly compress and install them into the grooves on the top of the bulb socket. Like so. Now, being careful that the reflector springs don't fall out, insert the socket assembly into the upper shell, but not entirely. You want to leave enough room so you can install the rectangular nut into the appropriate slot. Now the hole in this nut is not centered, so make sure the hole is facing slightly more forward when you install it. Now install the small bent electrical contact over the nut, making sure it slides into the recessed area. Now slide the entire assembly into the shell a little bit more, but still not all the way. This can be tricky, but make sure the electrical contact stays in place over the nut as the assembly is inserted. Now you should only have a small amount of the sync pin holes in the socket exposed above the shell. Using those gaps, insert the two brass sync tabs, making sure they also sit in their recesses. With everything in place, carefully insert the assembly into the shell completely, hopefully capturing all of the pieces in place. This can be tricky to do since we only have two hands, but if something should move, simply remove the assembly, realign the parts, and try again until everything is seated properly. You want the sync tabs to be perfectly aligned with the pinholes in the socket and the hole in the rectangular nut fully exposed. From here, we can secure the assembly to the shell using the short countersunk screw and screwing it into the rectangular nut. Now, using either the sync pin tool from the Graflex shop or an equivalent nut driver, install the front two sync pins through the tabs and thread them into the socket until they are tight. Using a pair of needle nose pliers, install two of the small sync pin springs into the rear sync pin holes. Now thread in the remaining two brass pins and again, thread them until they are tight. Next, we're going to install the long electrical contact through the back of the shell. This is where you're going to want to use needle nose pliers, or my preferred tool, hemostat clamps. I've even modded mine so they work a little bit better and hold this contact more securely. This can be tricky to do, but install it with the arm with the hole in it sliding into the upper red button hole. If you can't see the contact from inside the hole, then it's not inserted properly. Once in place, secure it with one of the steel square drive pins. This can be tricky to do also without the proper tool, which unfortunately I don't have, but you can do it with a pair of pliers with some finesse. Once tight and the contact is secured, install the third small spring into the front pinhole and secure it with the second steel pin. We can now install the test bulb and glass eye, or no bulb and a red button if you're doing ESB. Now if you care about the test bulb functioning, it might be worth ensuring that it does so now before we get any further in. If you don't care if the bulb functions, or if you're doing an ESB, you can proceed to the next step. So to test this, simply install the test bulb and glass eye into the socket and upper shell. Then make sure that your large battery spring is installed in the lower half and make sure it is seated firmly. Then install 3 D batteries with the positive node facing up. 2 will go in the bottom shell, with 1 going in the upper shell. Assemble the 2 halves using a clamp. Slide the switch forward and look for the test bulb under the glass eye to light up. If it does, great work. If not, the most likely cause is the slide switch arm, the one that we bent earlier, isn't making contact with the bulb. To fix this, you will need to disassemble the flash, remove the bulb socket, and bend the arm forward more, which is much easier to do at this point rather than later. The other cause would be that you still have a raised edge where the 3 parts of the socket assembly meet and your slide switch is getting hung up. Again, to fix this, you will need to remove the socket assembly and either loosen the 3 parts and reposition, or file down the raised edge. Next, we're going to want to install the bunny ears, but before we do, we want to use our preferably toothless pliers to gently bend the tabs on the flash inwards. This will put more pressure on the bunny ears and prevent them from rattling, but be sure not to be too aggressive during this or you will remove the plating on the flash or cause worse damage. We're just bending them in ever so slightly so that they're slightly facing each other rather than perfectly parallel with each other. It doesn't take much. With the tabs bent, we can assemble the ears themselves. It doesn't matter which side the ring rivet is on, but I always put them on the right. Make sure to assemble the 2 halves so no one side sits more offset than the other. As you can see, right now, the expandable ring is sitting nicely within the other ear. You do not want them offset. like this, because as you can see, they will not be perfectly aligned. Holding them together, slide the threaded spacer in the hole, securing them together. The spacer is only threaded on one half, so be sure that whatever direction you install the ears in, the threads in the spacer are facing the rear. As you can see, no threads in that side, but there are threads in that side. So as I said, make sure that the threaded side faces the rear when you install the ears into the flash. You may need to pinch the ears together to get them past the shell, but be careful not to scratch the plating on the ears as they go in. Now it can be difficult to get these in because sometimes the spacer in the center of the ears likes to move around, it likes to fall out. So just be gentle and have patience, and be sure to pinch the ears as you're sliding them up through. With the tabs bent in, it may take a little pressure and wiggling to get the ears to seat properly, but once they do, you can insert the threaded rivet. With the threads of the spacer being in the rear, the rivet should slide halfway in without needing to be threaded. Once it contacts the threads, it will need to be threaded the rest of the way. This may only be able to be done by hand if your alignment is straight enough, but if not, you can use your pliers to gently grab the rivet head and thread it in. Again, this is where smooth pliers come in handy to avoid damaging the head. While threading the rivet, it may get hung up and hit a tight spot. Just pinch the ears or wiggle them around to relieve tension, and it should continue to thread in the rest of the way. The rivet is meant to also thread into the rear tab, so once it's through the spacer, look to make sure the ears are aligned with the tab and thread the rivet the rest of the way. If it's not aligned, simply rock the ears up and down until it does. If your rivet happens to be loose and you're worried about it falling out, you can remove it and apply just a tiny drop of blue Loctite to the end of the threads and reinstall it. Now we have our threaded rivet firmly in place and sitting flush. Next, we're going to install the red button and the beer tab. Be sure not to use any part of the beer tab if you're building an ESB hilt. Both the beer tab itself and the washer have a sharp side and a more rounded edge side. Be sure to install them with the rounded side up. Slide the threaded beer tab rivet through the beer tab and washer and thread it into the top hole in the shell. Thread it until it won't thread anymore. Note that the rivet is shouldered, so even when it's tight, the beer tab will still spin freely. Slightly bending one ear of the beer tab, begin threading the bottom of the red button. Once fully inserted, thread the red button into the shell and tighten. Double check that your red button has travel and isn't rigid, and that your slide switch still moves freely and completely. And with that, you're all done. You now have a completed and fully functional Graflex flash handle ready to be converted into an awesome static prop or even used on a vintage camera. So that's it, guys. That's how you assemble and install a complete bulb socket assembly. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, be sure to let me know in the comments section below. And if you liked this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. It really helps me out a lot. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing and checking out all of my other videos, and stay tuned for new ones coming in the near future. So thank you again, and as always, may the force be with you.